On the 12th of June, 1887, a Korean picture bride named Soon-hee Park was dragged from a burning seed shed on the Hale Ranch, her mother's quilted seed pouch torn from her hands and thrown into the flames. Odette Hale and the men who worked for her held the deed to that land, the loyalty of the town, and the law itself in Deputy Fry's holster. Everyone expected Soon-hee to be sent back east on the next wagon, one more failed contract bride forgotten by autumn. What Jonas Hale did instead, in the ash and smoke of that same night, would be spoken of in Cottonwood Bend for 30 years. Soon he had crossed an ocean believing a photograph and a letter could be trusted more than the men who sent them. The broker in San Francisco had called Jonas Hale a steady man with good land, and steady he was, in the way that stones are steady, saying little, watching everything. She had not expected kindness so much as tolerance, a roof and a ledger entry, and for the first weeks that was exactly what she received, measured out like flour from a jar that never seemed quite full enough for her. It was Odette who first called her a mail-order curiosity within earshot, and Odette who decided, before soon he had unpacked a single trunk, that no foreign woman would inherit what Mary Hale had once been promised. The seed pouch became the target because it was the one thing soon he guarded with both hands, and cruelty, Odette had learned long ago, works best against what a person cannot bear to lose. Higgins at the store weighed her coins twice, as if foreign silver might be lighter than the rest. Jonas noticed the way she pressed her thumb to the pouch each morning before chores, the way her lips moved without sound over the seeds inside, and though he asked nothing, he began arriving at the shed door earlier than the ranch hands, as if his presence alone might discourage what he had already begun to suspect Odette was planning. He did not know yet that his silence would not be enough, that fire moves faster than watching, and that what he chose to do in the minutes after the flames caught would follow him for the rest of his life. Soon-hee Park had crossed an ocean and half a continent with her mother's garden folded into a square of cloth no larger than a hymnal. She remembered Incheon less as a place than as a season of hands, her mother's hands pressing seed into black soil behind their house, counting rows in a voice that never rose above a murmur, naming each plant as though it were a cousin owed respect. The perilla came up first every spring, its leaves broad and faintly purple-veined, and her mother would crush one between her fingers and hold it to Soon-hee's nose and say, "This is what August smells like." That smell had followed her across the Pacific in steerage, through the fog of San Francisco Bay, through 3 days on a train that flattened the world into wheat-colored distances, and through a jolting wagon ride north from the rail spur into country so wide and so empty that soon he had begun to wonder if the broker's letter had described a real place at all. The letter itself she still carried, folded soft as cloth from handling, a photograph of a man named Jonas Hale, unsmiling, his jaw set like a man posing for a coffin rather than a courtship, and beneath it, a mission house matron's careful script promising a rancher of good standing, sober habits, and 1,100 acres along a creek that did not run dry. Her mother had died the winter before the letter came, and it was her mother's sister who had pressed the seed pouch into Soon-hee's hands at the dock and told her that a woman without land of her own must at least carry the memory of land inside her sleeve. Soon-hee had not fully understood the weight of that instruction until the wagon crested a low rise and the Hale Ranch came into view, a house of milled pine with a chimney of raw fieldstone, smoke threading up into a sky so vast it seemed to erase the house's size rather than frame it, cattle scattered dark against new grass, and beyond it all the creek cutting a silver line she could not yet judge for kindness or cruelty. The driver, an older ranch hand who had said perhaps 6 words to her since San Francisco, reined the horses in at a respectful distance from the porch, as though even he understood that whatever happened next was not his to hurry. Jonas Hale came out onto the porch before she had climbed down from the wagon, and Soon-hee's first impression of him was not unkindness but distance, a stillness so complete it seemed rehearsed, as though he had practiced standing exactly there, exactly like that, so many mornings that his body no longer needed instruction from him. He was taller than the photograph had suggested and leaner, his forearms corded from work rather than idleness, and he studied her the way a man studies weather he cannot yet name, not hostile, but withholding judgment until the sky showed its intention. He said her name once, carefully, Soon-hee, getting the vowels almost right, and she answered with a small bow from the neck that she had practiced in the mirror of the boarding house in San Francisco, uncertain whether such a gesture would read here as grace or strangeness. Before he could say more, the door behind him opened and a second figure filled it, A woman, perhaps 60, silver-haired, dressed in unrelieved black despite the mild spring air, her eyes moving over Soon-hee with the swift, itemizing thoroughness of an auctioneer assessing stock. This was Odette Hale, though Soon-hee would not learn until later that the name Hale belonged to her only by marriage to a daughter now 3 years dead, that she was mother-in-law and not mother, widow of grief rather than widow of blood claim, and that this distinction, small as it seemed, would come to matter enormously. Odette did not offer her hand. She looked instead at the cloth bundle Soon-hee carried against her chest, the way another woman might carry an infant, and something in her face tightened, not quite a frown, more the flicker of a woman recalculating a sum she had already believed settled. Jonas took Soon-hee's single trunk from the wagon bed himself, waving off the driver's help with a short motion, and as he set it down on the porch boards he looked once, briefly, at the bundle in her arms, and something crossed his face too, though it was gentler than Odette's. Curiosity, perhaps, or the shadow of a question he did not yet feel entitled to ask a woman he had married that morning at the courthouse in town, and had not yet spoken more than 9 words to in his life. The first weeks arranged themselves into a pattern so consistent that soon he began to recognize it the way she had once recognized weather fronts on the sea, a pressure building long before the storm broke visibly. At Higgins's general store in town, she counted out coins for a sack of flour and watched the man's scale dip, watched him frown at it as though the machine itself had betrayed him, and add a second small weight before he would release the sack into her hands, though she had seen him wave the Perkins boy through with the same order and no such ceremony an hour before. She said nothing. She had learned on the crossing that certain battles cost more than they were worth to a woman traveling alone in a country that had not decided yet whether to call her neighbor or curiosity. Jonas, she noticed, said nothing in front of her either, though twice she caught him afterward bent over Higgins's ledger book at the counter with the storekeeper's pencil in his own hand, correcting figures in a low voice that stopped the moment she came within earshot, and Higgins's face reddening in a way that had nothing to do with the spring sun. At the ranch hands were less careful with their cruelty than Higgins had been with his scale. They mimicked her accent behind the barn, where they believed the wind carried their voices away from the house, drawing out her vowels into something ugly and sing-song, and one of them, a broad young man named Purcell, took to calling her Mrs. Squint, within hearing of the bunkhouse, until Jonas, passing close enough to hear it once, said only the man's name, Purcell, in a voice so flat and quiet that the word itself did the work of a blow, and the mimicry did not happen again in front of him, though soon he suspected it continued elsewhere, folded into corners the way cruelty always finds corners when it cannot find open ground. Odette's cruelty took a different shape entirely, quieter and more patient, the cruelty of a woman who had run this household long enough to know that rearranging another person's few possessions without asking was its own kind of speech. Soon he would return from the garden to find her trunk's contents refolded, her thread box moved from the windowsill to a drawer, her few hair combs relocated to a shelf too high to reach without a stool, each small violation impossible to name as an accusation and yet unmistakable in its intention, a slow siege conducted entirely through the furniture. It was in the garden, in the last hour before dusk, that soon he first noticed the child watching her from the fence line, a girl of perhaps 8, barefoot despite the cool ground, her dress patched at both knees with cloth that did not match, her hair escaping its braid in a way that suggested no one had stood over her that morning to smooth it. The girl did not approach at first, she simply watched, perched on the top rail like something that had grown there, her eyes following Soon-hee's hands as they turned the soil in rows straighter than anything else on the Hale property, rows measured by eye and old habit into the same disciplined geometry her mother had taught her in Incheon. Soon-hee learned her name 3 days later, offered almost reluctantly, as though the girl feared that giving it away might cost her something. Maddie Calhoun, she said, from the cabin past the second creek bend, and when Soon-hee asked, gently, whether she was hungry, Maddie's silence answered before her nod did. After that the girl came most evenings, drawn less by hunger, Soon-hee began to suspect, than by the strangeness and order of the garden itself, by the neat lines of turned earth that looked like nothing else in a country built on wide, careless distances. Maddie liked to crouch at the garden's edge and watch Soon-hee's hands work, and one evening, as Soon-hee knelt to loosen the drawstring of the cloth pouch she kept always near her, not yet planted, not yet risked to this unfamiliar soil, but carried close the way a woman carries something she is still deciding whether to trust to the world. Maddie's small voice broke the quiet at last. "What's in there?" she asked, pointing with her chin rather than her hand, as though pointing outright might be its own kind of trespass. Soon-Hee's fingers stilled on the drawstring. She looked down at the pouch, at the faint quilted stitching her mother's hands had made, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, turning over in her mind how much of her mother's garden, how much of Incheon, how much of everything she had lost and carried and feared losing again, she was prepared to hand a stranger's child in a single sentence, on land that did not yet feel like it would let her keep anything for long. Soon-Hee's fingers loosened on the drawstring, and she thought of her mother kneeling in the Incheon garden with the same pouch open across her knees, naming each seed the way another woman might name her children. She could give Maddie a name without giving her everything. "Doilke," she said finally, and touched the smallest of the 7 cloth compartments through the fabric, though she did not open it. "A leaf," she said, "that my mother pressed for oil, and for medicine when the chest goes tight in winter." Maddie repeated the word badly, dropping the vowel, and Soon-Hee corrected her once, gently, the way a teacher corrects a beloved and difficult student, and did not correct her again when the second attempt came out only slightly better. That was enough for one evening. She tied the drawstring and set the pouch back inside her apron pocket, and Maddie, satisfied with the single answer, returned to naming the vegetables Soon-Hee had already taught her: the squash, the beans strung on their poles, the neat cabbage starts that would not head for another month. From then on, Soon-Hee rose 2 hours before the ranch woke, dressing by the memory of where her clothes hung rather than by lamplight, because lamp oil was Odette's to ration, and Soon-Hee had already learned the cost of asking for anything twice. She worked the reclaimed ground behind the seed shed in the gray hour before the sky took on color, when the only sounds were her own breath and the distant complaint of cattle shifting in the pen, and she found that the labor did something the daylight hours at the house could not. It returned to her hands a kind of competence the rest of her life in Cottonwood Bend seemed built to deny. Here the soil answered to skill, and not to the accident of birth or the color of a woman's hair. She turned it in rows as straight as string, mounded it where the drainage ran wrong, broke the clods with the flat of a hoe her father-in-law by marriage, though she did not yet think of Jonas that way, kept hung by the shed door for want of any other use. Maddie came most mornings now too, drawn from the second creek bend before her own chores could claim her, and crouched at the fence rail to watch, and Soon-Hee let her carry water in a chipped tin pail that had once held nails, and taught her, in exchange for the company, the Korean words for dirt and root and rain, though never yet the word for seed itself, which she kept back the way she kept the 7th pouch back, as though naming a thing fully might be its own kind of risk in a country that had already taken so much from her by mishearing everything else she said. It was Jonas who first noticed the discipline of it, though he said nothing for the better part of 2 weeks. He rode the fence line before dawn as a matter of habit left over from his scouting years, when a man who woke late in unfamiliar country sometimes did not wake again, and twice now he had passed the shed and seen the shape of her working in the half-dark, bent low over the rows with a patience that struck him as belonging to some older and more exacting trade than farming. He did not approach. He had learned, in the 11 months since Mary's fever took her, that approaching people cost him more than it gave back, and he had settled into the habit of watching things from a distance and drawing his own conclusions rather than risking a conversation that might ask something of him he did not know how to give. But on the 14th morning he found himself at the well at the same hour she came to draw water for the rows, and there was no way to fill his own bucket without standing near enough to speak. And so, gruffly, without preamble, he asked her why she worked before the sun was up when no one required it of her. Soon he straightened, wiped her palms on her apron, and answered as plainly as the question had been put. "Idle hands starve," she said, in English still careful and deliberate, each word set down like a stone she meant to stand on. Jonas turned the words over. It was not an answer he had expected, though he could not have said what he had expected instead, and there was something in its bluntness that matched something in his own nature so exactly that he found himself, against every instinct toward silence he had cultivated since Mary died, answering her honestly in return. He had not meant to keep talking. He said only that a ranch this size ran on hands willing to rise before they were told to, and that he had not seen that kind of willingness on the place in some time, and then, embarrassed by how much that admission had let slip, he filled his bucket and turned back toward the barn without waiting for her to respond. Soon he watched him go, the water sloshing at his boot heels, and turned the exchange over in her mind the way she turned soil, carefully, expecting to find something buried in it. It was the first time since San Francisco that anyone in this country had answered a plain question with an equally plain truth, and she found she wanted, quietly and without daring to examine the wanting too closely, for it to happen again. The word came out of Maddie at supper 3 nights later, unguarded and entirely without malice, the way a child repeats a song she has learned without knowing what the verses mean. She had asked to be excused to go check on the beans, and when Odette told her the beans could wait until morning, Maddie had muttered under her breath, half in complaint, a single syllable soon he, recognized instantly, and Odette did not recognize at all, which was precisely what made Odette's spoon stop halfway to her mouth. She set it down with a precision that was somehow louder than if she had dropped it. "Where," she asked Maddie, "did you learn to talk like that?" Maddie, sensing too late the size of the silence she had stepped into, looked to Soon-Hee for rescue, and found none she knew how to give, without making the trouble worse, and so she said nothing, which Odette took, correctly, as its own confession. Odette's gaze crossed the table and settled on Soon-Hee with a weight that had been building since the first night, since the look she had given the seed pouch on Soon-Hee's very first evening in this house, and something in her face suggested that weeks of quiet cataloging had finally found their subject. "So it is you, filling the girl's head with your language," Odette said, not a question. Soon-Hee set down her own fork, matched Odette's stillness with her own, and answered that she had only taught Maddie the names of the plants they tended together, nothing more, thinking the truth plain enough to end the matter. It did not end the matter. Odette rose from her chair with the unhurried authority of a woman who had run this household long before any bride, contracted or otherwise, had set foot in it, and said that the garden was one thing. She had tolerated the garden, though she had not approved of it, but that Maddie Calhoun was a Christian child of this county, and would not be raised to babble in a heathen tongue behind her family's back, and that soon he would keep her lessons to herself from this evening forward, in the garden and everywhere else. The word heathen landed in the room and did not leave it. Jonas, who had said almost nothing through supper as was his habit, set down his own utensil now with a stillness that drew every eye to him without his having to raise his voice at all, and for a moment, the kitchen held its breath waiting to see which way the silence would break. "She is my wife," Jonas said, and nothing more than that. 5 words, flat and unhurried, delivered in the same register he might have used to note that rain was coming or that a fence post wanted mending, but they landed in the kitchen with a weight entirely out of proportion to their length, because in 11 months of Odette's unquestioned rule over this house, no one had spoken to her in that tone, and lived comfortably in the house afterward. Odette's mouth opened as if to answer him and then did not, which was itself a kind of answer, a first crack in an authority she had never once had to defend aloud because no one had ever made her. She looked at her son-in-law, a title that had grown thinner and thinner since Mary's death, though neither of them had ever said so, and seemed for a moment to be recalculating some sum she had believed settled. Soon he, watching, understood that something had shifted in the room that had nothing to do with the Korean word Matty had let slip, and everything to do with the fact that Jonas Hale, who spoke perhaps 40 words on an ordinary day, had chosen to spend 5 of them defending her, in front of witnesses, without being asked. Odette recovered herself enough to say that she had only meant to protect the child's upbringing, that she meant no harm by it, words that did not match the color still rising in her throat, and then she excused herself from the table with a correctness so brittle it was its own kind of accusation, and left the kitchen without once looking back at either of them. Maddie exhaled as though she had been holding her breath since the first mention of her name, and reached without thinking for Soon-Hee's sleeve, a small unconscious gesture of allegiance that Soon-Hee felt more than she let herself show. Jonas said nothing further. He finished his supper in the same silence he had kept through most of it, as though the 5 words had cost him everything he had budgeted for speech that evening, and rose afterward to check the horses in a chore that did not, strictly, need checking at that hour. But later, long after the house had gone dark and soon he lay awake, turning the evening over in her mind the way she turned soil, she heard, faint through the thin wall, the sound of the kitchen door easing open and Odette's tread crossing the yard toward the barn, unhurried, deliberate, and beneath the wind, she thought she caught the low murmur of a second voice answering her. And then a third, though she could make out no words at all, only the shape of a conversation that was clearly not meant to be overheard, and she lay listening to it long after the voices had gone quiet, unable to name what unsettled her about it beyond the plain fact that Odette Hale did not go to the barn at night for any reason Soon He had yet been given cause to trust. The fence line on the north pasture had gone slack through winter, and Jonas worked the wire with his sleeves rolled to the elbow while Soon He held the post steady with both hands, her boots braced in the churned mud. Neither of them spoke for the length of 3 posts. She had learned, in her weeks at Cottonwood Bend, that his silences were not the silences of men who had nothing to say, but of a man rationing something he kept in short supply, and she had stopped filling them with her own words the way she once had at the mission school, where quiet was corrected out of a girl before she was 16. Here quiet was simply the weather. Jonas drove a staple with 2 strikes of the hammer, tested the wire's give with his thumb, and moved to the next post without looking at her. Though he had positioned himself, she noticed, so that the wind carried the worst of the cold away from where she stood. When the fence was done to the creek bend, he did not say it was done. He simply straightened, rolled his shoulders once, and looked toward the house as if measuring the distance back by the ache already starting in his back. Soon he gathered the loose staples from the grass into her apron pocket, the small unthanked task of a wife, and fell into step half a length behind him, out of habit rather than deference. They walked without speaking past the well, and it was there, without any signal she could name, that he stopped. He set the coil of spare wire down against the stone lip and looked into the bucket as though something in it required his attention, though it held only rainwater and a skin of ice at the rim. She waited, because waiting had become, in this house, its own kind of language. "Purcell says you're up before the rooster," he said finally, not quite a question, his eyes still on the water. She told him again what she had told Purcell weeks before, though this time without the flatness she had used to fend off an insult. "Idle hands starve," her mother used to say it over the winter beds when the frost threatened the last of the cabbages, and soon he had carried the saying the way she carried everything else that survived the crossing, folded small and close. Jonas was quiet long enough that she thought the conversation had ended the way most of theirs did, unfinished by mutual agreement. Then he said that he had not seen anyone work a piece of ground like that since his mother kept a garden behind the old cabin before the war took the roof off it, and half the family with it, and that he had forgotten, until soon he's rose went in straight and early, that dirt could be a thing a person chose, rather than a thing a person was simply stuck farming. It was the longest sentence she had heard him speak since her arrival, and she understood, hearing it, that he had been counting his words all along, not from coldness, but from the same instinct that made her fold her sleeves twice before kneeling in the beds, a fear of spending something down to nothing. Supper that evening was thin stew and hard bread, eaten at the long table with Odette seated at its head out of a habit no one had thought to question since Mary's death, and Jonas at the foot in the chair that had likely been his father's before him. Mattie had been sent home to the Calhoun cabin before dark, and the house without her had a stillness that pressed down harder than usual, broken only by the scrape of spoons and the wind finding the gap under the kitchen door. Soon he ate with the careful economy of someone raised to make a small portion look sufficient, and it was Jonas, not Odette, who noticed and pushed the bread plate an inch closer to her without comment. Odette saw the gesture and said nothing, but her jaw said in the particular way soon he had learned to read as a held tongue rather than an absent one. After the dishes were cleared and Odette had retired to the front room with her mending, Jonas lingered at the table in a way that was unusual enough that soon he, wiping the last plate dry, found herself lingering too, matching his stillness because she did not know what else the moment asked of her. He asked, without preamble, about the garden behind the shed. Not the vegetables, which he had already seen rise green and orderly in their rows, but what she had said to Mattie about the seeds, the word the girl had repeated at this very table, and set off Odette's questioning. Soon he told him, carefully, that her mother had kept a garden in Inchin behind a house with a blue gate, and that when the broker's letter came and the marriage was arranged, her mother had spent 3 nights sewing seeds into a cloth pouch instead of sleeping, saying that a daughter should not cross an ocean with empty hands, even if her hands held nothing anyone in this new country would recognize as a dowry. 7 kinds, she said, holding up fingers as she counted them the way her mother had taught her, though she did not name all 7 aloud. Some habit of guardedness keeping the fullest truth folded the same way the pouch itself stayed folded at the bottom of her trunk. Jonas listened with his forearms on the table and his eyes on her hands rather than her face, which she had come to understand was his particular way of paying full attention without the discomfort of open staring. When she finished, he was quiet again, turning something over, and then he said that he had not felt useful to another living soul since Mary died, that the ranch ran itself around him more than because of him most days, and that watching the ground behind the shed go from weeds to rows had been the first thing in 3 years that felt like it mattered whether he showed up for it or not. It was not a declaration, and he did not dress it as one, but soon he heard the size of it anyway, the way a person hears a door unlatch in another room of a quiet house. He asked, almost as an afterthought, whether she would show him the seeds sometime, the ones still folded away, and she said yes before she had fully decided to, surprising herself with how easily the word came, and they agreed, without ceremony, that she would bring the pouch out after the Sunday chores were finished, 4 days from that night, a small appointment neither of them wrote down anywhere but would, before the week was out, become a promise the fire made impossible to keep whole. The barn conversation soon he had overheard through the thin wall bore its fruit on the night of the 12th of June, though nothing in the evening itself gave warning of what the dark would carry. Supper had passed ordinarily enough, Odette civil in the brittle way she had been civil since Jonas's 5 words at the table, Mattie absent at the Calhoun cabin, the ranch settling into its usual late sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and wind moving through the cottonwoods along the creek. Soon he had gone to bed with the small satisfaction of the Sunday appointment still 4 days off, turning it over the way a person turns a coin in a pocket, and had fallen asleep with the seed pouch, as always, tucked beneath the edge of her pillow rather than in the trunk, a habit she had never explained to anyone and no one had asked about. She woke first to smell, not sound, a bitterness under the ordinary night smells of hay and horse and creek, damp, sharp enough to pull her up out of sleep before her mind had caught what it meant. By the time she reached the window, the seed shed was no longer merely smoking. Flame had already taken the near wall and was climbing toward the roof shakes with a speed that seemed to mock the stillness of the rest of the yard, throwing orange light across the packed earth and up into the low branches of the nearest cottonwood. She did not remember deciding to run. She remembered only the door under her hand, the cold of the yard through her bare feet, and the shed's heat reaching her 10 strides before she reached it, a wall of it that made her arms come up instinctively to shield her face. The seed store was just inside, on the shelf she had built herself from a scrap plank and 2 nail kegs, and she was reaching for the door latch when a hand closed hard around her arm and pulled her backward with a force that knocked the breath from her before she understood it was Jonas, in his nightshirt and bare feet same as her, shouting something she could not process over the roar the fire had already found in the dry roof beams. He hauled her clear to the far side of the yard, past the water trough, and shoved her down onto the ground there with an instruction to stay that brooked no argument, the first time she had heard true volume in his voice since her arrival. Then, before she had fully understood she was safe, he was gone again, back toward the burning structure at a dead run, and she screamed his name into the smoke without knowing if the sound reached him at all over the collapsing timber. He came out of the smoke a second time with his forearm blackened along one side and his nightshirt scorched at the sleeve, staggering the last few steps before his knees found the dirt beside her, and in that moment, Soon-hee's whole attention narrowed to whether he was breathing rather than to anything he might be holding. He was. Ranch hands were arriving now with buckets from the trough, useless against a blaze already past saving, and Deputy Fry's name was being called somewhere in the confusion, though no one seemed to know why a lawman would matter to a burning shed. Soon he did not remember the shed finishing its collapse, only the moment after, kneeling in the ashfall with her hands raking through the still warm debris where the shelf had stood, finding scorched wood and the blackened remains of cloth that crumbled at her touch into nothing she could gather, 6 pouches reduced to char, and a smell that would return to her for months afterward at the edge of sleep. She did not think to look at Jonas in that hour. She did not see him press his uninjured hand flat against his own chest, over the coat he had grabbed and pulled on at some point in the chaos without her noticing, feeling through the lining the small hard shape of the one pouch that had been flung clear of the shelf in the first violent minute of the fire, landing just past the doorway where his second pass through the smoke and heat had found it, more by instinct than by sight, his fingers closing on cloth before his mind had even named what it was. He said nothing of it, not that night, kneeling beside her in the drifting ash with his arm already blistering beneath his torn sleeve, not the next morning, when Odette stood dry-eyed at the edge of the wreckage speaking of stray lantern sparks and bad luck, and not in the days after, when soon he moved through her chores with a hollowed quiet that even Mattie's chatter could not reach. Soon he believed, as anyone would have believed, that her mother's garden had gone entirely to smoke, that the 7 varieties folded so carefully in Incheon were now 7 kinds of ash, indistinguishable from the shed's burned planks. And she carried that belief through her days, the way she had once carried the pouch itself, close and constant and impossible to set down. She did not know, could not have known, that inside the coat now hanging damp and singed on a peg by Jonas's bed lay the black perilla her mother had pressed for oil and for medicine, held against a man's ribs through the worst night of the ranch's memory, kept there in a silence he had not yet found a way to break, waiting on a truth he was not ready to hand her until it had grown into something strong enough to survive the telling. Deputy Willem Fry walked the burned frame of the shed with his hat pushed back, kicking at a blackened plank while Odette stood a careful distance off, her arms folded against the morning chill, describing for the 3rd time how she had smelled kerosene from a knocked lantern before the flames took hold. Fry wrote it in his small book without looking up, and Reverend Cyrus Bell, who had ridden out at first light with a jar of salve for burns no one had yet mentioned to him, stood at the edge of the ash, listening to a story that fit together a little too cleanly for a fire no one claimed to have seen start. He asked only one question, whether anyone had checked the lantern hook still bolted inside the doorframe, untouched by flame, and Odette answered so quickly that the Reverend's mouth tightened at one corner before he thanked her and said nothing further. By noon, the story had traveled from the Hale Ranch to Higgins's counter to the porch of the church house, a stray spark, a foreign woman's shed, a shame but no one's fault. Soon he heard it secondhand from Mattie, who repeated it uncertainly, watching her face for some correction that never came, because soon he had no other explanation to offer and had learned in 5 months at Cottonwood Bend that a Korean bride's word carried less weight in this town than a widow's shrug. She sat that evening on the porch step with her mother's remaining pouches beside her, 6 of paper and ash now, the 7th she did not know to grieve since she believed it gone with the rest. And she turned over in her mind the shape of a wagon east, the mission house in San Francisco that had first written her name into a broker's ledger, the possibility of undoing a marriage contract before it had properly become a life. She had not said this aloud to Jonas. She had barely spoken to him since the fire, not from anger but from the particular exhaustion of grief that made even gratitude feel like more weight than she could lift. Through the kitchen window she could see Odette moving with unusual lightness, humming some hymn fragment as she wiped down a shelf, and the sight of that ease settled into Soon-hee's chest like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward long after the stone itself had gone still. She thought of her mother's hands guiding the needle through the seed pouch's seams 3 nights running before the ship, and she wondered, not for the first time, whether a harvest could survive being planted twice, once in Incheon soil, once in Wyoming ash, or whether some things, once burned, simply refused the ground a second time no matter how carefully a person knelt to try. The next morning she packed nothing, but she walked to Higgins's store with a coin purse thinned by 5 months of careful spending, intending only to ask, quietly and without drama, when the next eastbound wagon might pass through on its way toward the rail line. Higgins looked at her with the particular blankness of a man deciding whether a question deserved an honest answer, and it was in that pause, with 3 ranch hands loitering near the pickle barrel and a woman from the church circle pretending to study a bolt of calico while listening hard, that Jonas came through the door still in his work coat, dust on his boots from the morning ride, and understood in a single glance what she was asking before Higgins had said a word. He did not raise his voice. He set his hand flat on the counter, not quite touching her, and said that his wife would not be needing wagon prices, that she belonged at the Hale Ranch same as any Hale had ever belonged there, and that any man or woman in Cottonwood Bend who treated her as less than that would find him standing in their doorway asking why. The store went silent enough that the creak of the scale chain was the loudest sound in the room. Higgins's jaw worked once before he nodded and busied himself with a shelf that did not need arranging. The woman by the calico set the bolt down without buying it and left. Soon he stood very still, the coin purse forgotten in her hand, feeling something crack open in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but some third thing with no clean name, because this was the first time since the fire that anyone had chosen her plainly, in daylight, in front of people who mattered to the town's opinion of her. Jonas did not look at her as he said it, keeping his eyes on Higgins and the room instead, as though the words were a fence line he was walking, rather than a confession he was making, and only after the store had returned to its ordinary murmur did he glance her way, briefly, with something unreadable moving behind his guarded face. Reverend Bell had come in during the last of it to collect a parcel for the church, and he stood now near the door with the parcel forgotten under his arm, watching Jonas Hale's back with an expression that had nothing to do with the wagon prices or the flour scale, his mind turning instead over the memory of a lantern hook bolted clean and untouched inside a burned doorframe, and the growing uncomfortable certainty that the story he had helped the town believe was not the whole of what had happened that night. The cold frame took Jonas 11 nights to build, working after soon he had gone to bed and before the ranch hands rose for chores, hauling salvaged glass panes from the old greenhouse frame behind the barn and setting them low against a south-facing bank near the creek, where the water's nearness kept the soil from freezing hard. He worked by lantern light turned low, his burned forearm still tender enough that he wrapped it before lifting anything heavy, and when the frame was finished he pressed the single surviving perilla seed into a shallow trench of creek-silted earth with the same careful economy of motion he used mending fence or setting a foal's leg, as though tenderness toward growing things were simply another form of ranch work he had always known and never had occasion to practice. He told no one. He watched the seedling's first pale shoot break the soil in the second week of that autumn with something close to disbelief, crouching in the frost-touched dawn with his coat pulled tight, and it was on one of those mornings that Mattie Calhoun found him there, having wandered down from the Calhoun cabin before sunrise chasing a barn cat that had slipped its rope. She did not ask what the plant was so much as she simply knew, in the quick, unclouded way children know things adults spend hours deciding whether to say aloud, that this was Soonhees and that it was a secret. Jonas crouched beside her at the frame's edge and told her, in the fewest words he could manage, that the seed had lived and that he meant to give it back whole, not as ash, not as a story, but as a harvest strong enough to prove the ground hadn't beaten it, and that this required time he wasn't yet ready to explain to its owner. Mattie considered this with the gravity of an 8-year-old handed a task larger than her years, then spat in her palm and held it out the way she'd seen the ranch hands seal a bet, and Jonas, after a startled beat, shook it. From then on she came most mornings before the cat could be blamed twice, carrying creek water in a tin cup when the frame's soil ran dry, standing watch while Jonas thinned the small planting and turned the earth around it, the two of them bound by a promise neither fully understood the weight of, though Mattie at least understood enough to keep her mouth shut at supper, even when Odette, newly quiet since the store but no less watchful, asked where she'd been getting mud on her boots so early in the day. It was mending harness leather together at the tack bench, weeks into the cold frame's secret keeping, that soon he first saw the scar plainly, Jonas having pushed his sleeve back to keep it clear of the oil and all, the burned skin along his forearm healed now into a raised, twisting mark unlike any weather roughness she had seen on him before. She set down the strap she was threading and asked him directly, without the softening a more cautious wife might have used, how he had come by it, because the fire had left its mark on the shed and on her mother's garden, but she had believed, until that moment, that it had left no mark on him beyond the singed sleeve she'd noticed and forgotten in the chaos of that night. Jonas's hands stilled on the leather. He told her it was an old mark from before their marriage, a rope burn from breaking a green colt 2 winters back, the kind of injury any rancher collected and shed no more thought on than a callus. And he said it evenly, without hurry, in the same flat register he used for weather and fence counts, so that only the faint delay before he spoke, the half-second in which his jaw set before the words came, betrayed that something in the answer had cost him more than the sentence itself suggested. Soon he did not press him. She had grown up watching her mother read a room by the things left unsaid in it, and something in the stillness of his shoulders told her that whatever truth sat behind the scar, he was not yet willing to hand it to her, and that pushing would only close a door she had spent months learning to keep propped open. But she carried the lie differently than she carried his silences about Mary, or his guarded quiet about the years before Cottonwood Bend, because those silences had never once contradicted something her own eyes had seen, and this one did. She remembered, however dimly through smoke and terror, the shape of him going back a second time toward the burning doorway, and she had told herself in the days after that grief had blurred the memory into something that hadn't happened. Now, sitting across the tack bench with the false rope burn story hanging between them, she was no longer sure grief had blurred anything at all. She finished the strap she was threading and set it aside without meeting his eyes, and over the following weeks, she found small, unspoken ways to put distance between herself and the growing warmth they had built at the well and the fence line. An extra chore taken on alone, a supper eaten a few minutes earlier than his, a conversation allowed to end a sentence sooner than it might have, not from anger, which she could not fully justify even to herself, but from the quieter ache of loving a man whose truth she could feel circling just out of reach, waiting on some hour of his choosing rather than hers. The water came up gray and fast, carrying whole fence posts and the split trunk of a cottonwood that had stood by the creek longer than the ranch had a name. Jonas heard it before he saw it, a low, grinding roar under the ordinary sound of rain, and he was out of the house and running before he had thought the word flood, because the only thing his body understood in that first second was the cold frame, sitting low on the bank exactly where the water would reach first. He had built it 11 nights in a row the autumn before, salvaged glass and scrap pine, dug half into the earth so it would hold heat through the winter, and inside it, tended in secret through months he had told no one about, grew the single surviving pouch of black perilla he had pulled from the fire with his own burned arm. He reached the bank with the creek already lapping at the frame's low wall, brown water fingering into the seams, and he dropped to his knees in the mud and began hauling out what he could, potted starts and the shallow trays where the seedlings had been hardening off, working with a speed that had nothing careful left in it. The current took the ground out from under him before he understood it was happening, one boot sliding on a root slicked with silt, and he went down hard on his hip with an armful of trays held above the water like a man holding a child clear of a fire. He got up, went down again, the creek pulling at his legs now with real intention, cold enough to steal the breath out of him, and for 3 or 4 seconds that felt much longer, he could not find footing at all, and the water had him past the knee, past the thigh, dragging toward the bend where the current ran fastest and deepest. He drove his free hand into the exposed root of the old cottonwood stump and held there, breath coming ragged, the trays still lifted, and it was in that exact position, braced, soaked, half swallowed by the creek his ranch was named for, that soon he found him, having followed the sound of his boots pounding past the kitchen window into the storm without stopping to ask why. She did not call out his name so much as it tore out of her, and she was down the bank before caution could stop her, skirts already soaked to the knee, reaching for his free arm and hauling with a strength that surprised them both, until his boots found the underwater shelf of rock that let him stand. He came up out of the creek gasping, trays somehow still gripped against his chest, and it was only once his feet were solid under him that either of them looked past his shoulder to the cold frame itself, its glass panel cracked, its low wall half collapsed, and inside the shallow trench of dark soil, where something had clearly been growing for a long season, under cover no one had known to look for. Soon his eyes went from the frame to the burn scar visible now, where his soaked sleeve had ridden up his forearm, pale and ropey, and nothing at all like a rope burn from breaking a colt, and the understanding did not arrive in pieces the way it might have on a calmer day. It arrived whole. In the space of a single breath, the second trip into the burning shed she had half remembered and disbelieved, the lie he had told over the harness leather, the year of small, unexplained absences down by the creek that she had chalked up to ranch work and never once questioned. "You went back in," she said, not as a question, her voice nearly lost under the rain, and Jonas, still on his knees in the mud with the trays in his arms, did not deny it or soften it or offer the rope burn story a second time. "I found it flung clear of the door," he said. "I meant to give it back once it proved it could grow again." Before she could answer him, before either of them could say anything more against the roar of the rising water, a third voice cut across the bank, sharp with something that was not quite panic and not quite defiance, and they both turned to see Odette standing above them on the higher ground, drawn down by the shouting, her shawl already soaked through, her face white in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Behind her, picking their way down the slope, came Deputy Willem Fry and 2 of the ranch hands who had followed the commotion from the barn, and it was into that gathering audience, with the creek still climbing toward the frame, and toward all 3 of them, that Odette opened her mouth and said the thing she had carried unspoken for 11 months, that the fire had not been a lantern spark at all, that she had ordered it lit herself, and that she had believed until this exact moment on this exact bank that nothing of Soon-He's mother had survived it. The flood crested that night and receded by the second morning, leaving the creek bank scoured and strange, but the confession Odette had made in front of Deputy Fry and half the ranch hands did not recede with it. There was no trial, no formal reckoning read out on a courthouse step, only a slow and total unraveling of the authority she had held in the Hale household since Mary's death, one that began with Jonas telling her plainly, in the kitchen where she had once rearranged Soon-hee's trunk without asking, that she would no longer have a hand in running anything under his roof. Within 2 weeks she had packed what belonged to her into a single trunk of her own and gone to stay with distant relatives near Laramie, and the ranch hands who had helped her light the shed that June night were let go before the month was out, their names spoken of afterward only in the past tense. Reverend Cyrus Bell, who had noticed the untouched lantern hook on the morning after the fire and said nothing for 11 months, stood before his congregation the first Sunday after the flood and corrected the record himself, telling the gathered town plainly that the fire had not been an accident of kerosene and carelessness, but a deliberate act against a woman who had done nothing to deserve it, and that he was sorry for the silence he had kept out of caution rather than conviction. The effect on Cottonwood Bend was not sudden, but it was real. Higgins began weighing Soon-hee's flour correctly without being reminded, and the churchwomen who had once looked past her in the aisle began to nod when she passed. Small corrections that meant less on their own than they did stacked one on top of another through the summer. Soon-hee did not ask for any of it and accepted all of it quietly, the way she had accepted the ranch's cruelty months before, without letting either extreme settle too deeply into how she understood her place there. What mattered more to her, through those slow weeks of the town righting itself, was the patch of ground behind the rebuilt shed, where Jonas had at last moved the surviving perilla plant into open soil under full sun, no longer needing the secrecy of a hidden cold frame by the creek, and where Mattie Calhoun appeared most mornings now without needing to sneak, kneeling in the dirt beside Soon-hee and asking the Korean names of things with an ease that would have gotten her scolded a year before. By October, the perilla had done what Jonas had waited a year to see it do, filling 3 long rows behind the shed with broad dark leaves that Soon-hee cut and hung to dry in bundles from the rafters, the same bitter green smell that had once filled a small house in Incheon, now filling a ranch kitchen in the Wyoming Territory instead. On the evening the last of it came down cured and ready, Jonas asked her to come out to the porch, where he had set a plain wooden box he had built himself in the evenings without telling her why, the wood sanded smooth and unstained, and when she opened it she found the dried perilla leaves laid inside in careful rows alongside a single seed head, saved whole for planting again the following spring. He did not make a speech of it, only said that he had wanted to give it back to her once it had proven itself against the same ground that had tried to burn it out, and that a year of silence had been the only way he knew to keep a promise safely until it was ready to be kept in the open. A handful of neighbors had gathered for the small supper that followed, Reverend Bell among them, and Mattie underfoot the whole evening with dirt still under her fingernails from the afternoon's harvest, and more than one of the guests eating at that table had been among the people who once looked away from Soon-hee in town without a second thought. Nothing was said about that at the meal, no accounting demanded or offered, because the point of the evening was not the reckoning but the harvest itself, sitting there dried and fragrant in a box built by a man who had carried its first surviving seed hidden in his coat lining for the better part of a year, rather than risk losing it a second time. The scarred coat itself no longer hung on the peg by his bed, where it had stayed through the winter and spring. Soon-hee had moved it herself, days earlier, to a hook by the front door, where it belonged now among the ordinary things of the household, rather than kept apart as something guarded and secret. When the last of the guests had gone and Mattie had fallen asleep against Jonas's side by the fire, Soon-hee walked out alone to the edge of the replanted garden in the last of the light, kneeling at the row nearest the shed and pressing a pinch of the dried leaf between her fingers until its scent rose up sharp and familiar into the cooling air, the same scent her mother's hands had carried across a kitchen, half a world and a lifetime away. Jonas came out a few minutes later, Mattie's hand caught loosely in his own where the girl had woken enough to follow him, and the two of them stood a little apart from her at the fence rail, giving her the kind of quiet neither of them would have known to offer a year before, while she knelt in the dusk with the last of her mother's garden alive again in the dirt in front of her, already turning over in her mind what she might choose to grow from it next.